Well, welcome to this latest video in our Opening Heaven's Door training course, where we encourage folk to be the very best they can be in this ministry of healing. And throughout this course, one of the themes that we keep coming back to is how can we learn from the ministry of Jesus? And we're kind of doing an occasional series throughout this year looking at some of the specific stories of Jesus healing the sick. And what can we learn from them as prayer ministers? And we should be learning from him, actually. It's very tempting to think, well, that was Jesus. He was the Son of God. It was easy for him. He was in a league of his own. But think about it. He ministered to those people. And then at one point, he sends his disciples and others out to minister. Now, as they went away from Jesus, they must have been thinking, well, what do we do? I mean, they hadn't read any books on healing. They hadn't done any courses on healing. All they had to go on was what they'd seen from the ministry of Jesus. They would have looked back at what he did, and that's what they would have had to do because there was nothing else to go on. And that's why I think it's so important for us as our primary source of how we minister to look to Jesus. What did he do? How did he minister? And then we can learn from that. And this month, the particular story I want us to look at is a story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. We find this in Mark chapter 1, beginning at verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. They immediately told Jesus about her. As he went to her, took her hand and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Now, in one sense, this is a very ordinary story, if we can call any of the healing stories ordinary, in that Simon's mother-in-law doesn't seem to be very ill. She has a fever. It could have been serious. We're simply not told that. But I wonder, what can we learn from it, from healing, from this particular story? Well, I think there are three things, actually. And the first is this. It's all about the naturalness of healing. There's something very easy and natural about the way that Jesus ministers to Peter, Simon's mother-in-law. There's no discussion about whether he ought to. It's entirely natural that he walks in and he does it. Now, as prayer ministers, I think sometimes we can build this idea that healing is somehow unnatural. In the sense that it happens infrequently, or only through certain people, or only for special people. And it may well be that that simply reflects our experience as we minister healing. Well, this story, I think, is so beautiful because it brings us right back to the heart of Jesus to heal. And it's that heart for healing, that naturalness of healing, that I'd love us to catch. And it was natural for him. If you think about it, Jesus had around 3 years of active ministry. 3 years to really shape, in a sense, the legacy he wanted to leave behind. And yet, so often over those 3 years, what we read about is him healing the sick. Sometimes individuals, sometimes small groups, sometimes entire crowds. But central to what he was doing was this ministry of healing. It was a natural thing to him. Why? Well, it's interesting because for most of those people, actually, we never read about them again, the ones that got healed. Some of them, I guess, Jesus never heard about them again. Sometimes we have stories whereby he finds somebody again and carries on some ministry, but for the large majority, we hear nothing about them after he ministered to them. But he still did it. Why? Because it mattered to him. Because this was his heart. It was the heart of Father God being displayed through the actions of Jesus. This is the naturalness of healing. Now, of course, that does raise a massive question, doesn't it? If it is so natural, if it's so much the heart of God, then why don't we seem to see more of it? What we're aiming to do through these talks is to look at the healing stories of Jesus. Then we need to look at this. How can we learn from that? How can we find, more healing through this ministry? And I think one thing I think we can learn at this stage is this. Sometimes the blockage might be us as prayer ministers. You see, I think if we approach a ministry time with that thought, well, it probably won't happen. It doesn't normally happen. It didn't happen last time. It hasn't happened this morning yet. Why would this be any different? If that's our attitude, I think that affects our expectation of what is going to happen. I say this because there's an amazing story in Matthew chapter 17. The context is that Jesus is with a few of his disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. That's what we call it. And he was transfigured. They had this incredible experience. The disciples saw him in all his glory. But the other disciples were left down at the bottom of the hill. And what they're doing while this is going on the top of the hill is they're involved in ministering. They're trying to pray for this boy. And evidently, as they're ministering to him, nothing seems to be happening. And so as Jesus appears perhaps around the corner, the boy's father spots Jesus and goes running over to Jesus and says, "Please, will you please help my son? Because I took him to your disciples and they can't help him. They can't do anything. Will you please bring healing to him?" And so Jesus does it. And he ministers. It probably doesn't take more than a few seconds and the boy is healed. We read the disciples go to Jesus, privately, and they ask him, well, why couldn't we do that? Maybe they'd sort of done the same thing as Jesus done. Maybe they'd used the same words Jesus did. And his reply is very telling. Because what he says to them is this: well, you couldn't do it because you have so little faith. You the disciples, you the prayer ministers, you're the ones who had so little faith. It wasn't down to the boy, it wasn't down to the boy's father or anybody else. It was you, the disciples. You were the ones whose faith was affecting the outcome of that situation. I find that deeply challenging. I really do, because I think it's always worth questioning the state of our faith. What am I expecting Jesus to do in this situation? Is it my expectation that he will bring healing? Am I actually more surprised if something did happen than if something didn't happen? Am I thinking, crumbs, it worked. Because that says something to us. So let's catch the truth that this healing was a natural thing for Jesus. It flowed through him in a very natural way. And I think it should through us. The second thing this story says to me is this, that actually a lot of this is to do with making connections. If you read the story about Peter's mother-in-law, the event just before this takes place in a synagogue. And Jesus is in the synagogue, and while he's there, the service is disrupted by a man with an evil spirit. And Jesus brings peace to the man, and everyone is amazed. Then, we're told, they left the synagogue, they went to Simon Peter's house, and they found Simon's mother-in-law in bed with a fever. And we read, they told Jesus about her. And the way I kind of picture this is that they make a connection between what they'd just seen in the synagogue and the sick person that's lying there on the bed. You know, they think, well, hang on, we've just seen him do that. Why couldn't he do this as well? If that was natural, why not this as well? I think that's a real challenge that confronts us, and an opportunity, actually. That what we're called to do, I think, is to build that connection between the Jesus we read about in the Gospels and the situations in which we find ourselves. Now, how can we do that better? Well, I wonder sometimes if a good practice would be, to perhaps if there's a team of you praying for people on a Sunday, or maybe it's just you, but to read a gospel story about healing. And let something of the power, let something of the immediacy, let something of the naturalness of it stir you, either as an individual or as a group. Make the connection between that story and between the situation that you're about to face yourself. And in one sense, I think our whole approach, the mission's approach to ministry, is about making that connection. Because what we try and do here very much is before we pray for anything, what we do is we want to encourage people to find for themselves the reality of the presence of the person of Jesus. To let them find Jesus, that he's there with them, that he's standing with them. And from his presence, well, our trust is that power will flow. And it's back to this sense of making these real connections. The third thing this story says to me is it's really all about the gentleness of Jesus. We're told that they come to the house and they mention this woman's needs to Jesus. And actually he responds to her with real gentleness and real tenderness. And he heals her. For a moment, put yourself in her position. By all accounts, quite an ordinary person. She's simply in the house where Jesus visits, and he heals her. She's not questioned about her life, about how good she is. She isn't asked to have any faith or anything like this. She's not asked to make any exorbitant promises about what she will do if she gets healed. He simply reaches down and healing flows. Could it really be as easy as that? There's some folk I know, they've been praying for years that God would touch them and heal them. Maybe you've been involved in ministry, praying for some people for an awful long time, seeking that touch, that healing, that we trust Jesus could still bring them. I think for me what this passage says is this: ultimately, it's all about the touch of Jesus, and it's not about us. And it's very tempting, I think, to try and make people jump through hoops prior to praying for them. But Jesus did none of that. He never asked people to repent of their sins before he prayed for them. I think he might have wanted change to happen afterwards, but it was never a condition before he prayed. People were not asked to analyze their issues, to try and find the root of their problems. They were simply there before Jesus. Wherever they met Jesus, they were met with unfailing grace and unfailing kindness. And my sense is that is how Jesus ministered. That's what folks should find in us as well. I often come back to this episode in Matthew chapter 12. And The gospel writer there has just recounted some of the ministry of Jesus. And what he seems to do is he seems to pause in that kind of narrative about Jesus, and he reflects on it by bringing in a quote from Isaiah. And the words he uses as he quotes from Isaiah are so beautiful, and they sum up the gentleness of Jesus. He says this: "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out." I love that, because it sums up just the sheer tenderness of how Jesus ministered. Let's face it, a lot of the folk that we will meet, a lot of the folk to whom we will minister, they are like bruised reeds. They're like smouldering wicks. They're hurt. They're damaged people. They're not very strong. That they don't have great inner resources to help themselves. And what Jesus does is he brings help to them, not hindrance in any way. So I hope you found this helpful. Again and again I find myself coming back to the stories of Jesus again and again, seeking to find something of his heart in those stories. Because as far as I can, I want to be like him when I minister. I encourage you to go to our website, healingmission.org. And you'll find there details of how you can register for this course. Because this course, I think, is a great thing. It's been running now for a couple of years, but you can join at any time. And there are folk from 45 different countries registered for it. And by registering, it's totally free, but just by registering, you have access to some other materials, some of the past talks, questions to ponder to help you reflect on the ministry in which you're involved. I'd love at this stage as well to encourage you to think about how you're using this course. Maybe you watch it on your own. And that might be because you're the only person involved in prayer ministry in your particular setting. But maybe there are others as well. And you might find it more helpful to watch it with somebody and let them grow in this ministry alongside you. You might want to consider getting a whole team together to watch it together so you can ask questions and learn about this glorious ministry. But above all, keep close to God as you minister to others, and let's reflect him as much as we can.